The air was heavy with the scent of wet stone and iron. It was dawn, and yet the sky above London looked like a funeral cloth, stretched tight, suffocating the city beneath. A cold mist rolled in from the Thames, carrying with it the whispers of 1,000 souls who had crowded into Whitehall for a spectacle they never thought they would see, the killing of a king. The scaffold stood at the heart of the yard, an ugly black platform against the pale fog. Sawdust was scattered thick across the boards to drink the blood that had not yet fallen. Soldiers surrounded it in rigid formation, their armor dull in the morning gloom, pikes and muskets raised to keep back the restless crowd. The people had gathered in silence, some in fury, others in disbelief, many in sorrow. Their king, once divine and untouchable, was about to be made mortal, and there, waiting in the shadows of the executioner's tent, stood a man who trembled, not with fear of death, but with fear of history. His name was Richard Brandon, the official executioner of London, the man who had severed heads of thieves, rebels, and traitors for decades. His blade had silenced nobles and peasants alike, but this was different. Before him was not another nameless criminal dragged from a dungeon. Before him was Charles Stuart, an anointed king, crowned by God, heir of a dynasty that had ruled for a century. Brandon's calloused hands that had gripped the axe for so long shook as though they no longer belonged to him. He knew what the Parliament wanted. He knew the price of refusal. And yet, somewhere deep within his chest, a thought screamed, louder than all the commands of generals and ministers. I will not kill a king. The night before, he had dreamt of it. In his sleep, the scaffold had stretched endlessly, a black bridge over a pit of fire. On one end stood the king, pale but regal, holding out his hands. On the other end, Brandon stood with his axe. But when he lifted it, he saw his own reflection. In the polished steel, his face was twisted, monstrous, no longer his own. He had woken, drenched in sweat, the echoes of phantom crowds roaring in his ears. Now, as dawn broke, he tightened the straps of his leather jerkin and rubbed his thumb over the worn handle of his axe. The wood was slick, not from dew, but from the oil he had rubbed into it. It was the only thing that had ever felt like an extension of himself. But today, it felt heavier than iron. A guard entered the tent, his voice cold. "They are ready for you." Brandon did not reply. His mouth was dry, his throat closing. He had seen death 1,000 times, but never like this. He had killed criminals condemned by men, but never one crowned by God. Outside, the murmurs swelled. A sea of eyes waited, eyes of commoners who had lost children to war, merchants who had watched their fortunes bleed away, soldiers who had marched in mud for years. They wanted vengeance, they wanted justice. But justice was a fragile word, and Brandon wondered if history itself would spit out this moment as poison. The king appeared, escorted by soldiers. Charles I walked with a strange calm, as though he were stepping not toward his end, but toward immortality. He wore 2 shirts beneath his cloak, not from vanity, but so that the crowd would not see him shiver, for he feared that if he trembled, they would think it was fear rather than the bitter January cold. His eyes scanned the scaffold, the axe, the block, and then they settled, for a fleeting second, on Brandon. That gaze pierced the executioner deeper than any blade. Brandon lowered his eyes, ashamed. He had beheaded men who had begged, cursed, screamed, and spat at him. But never had he faced a man who looked at him with the quiet pity of a king, who knew he was about to be betrayed by his own people. The crowd grew restless. Shouts echoed like cracks in stone. "Tyrant," one voice spat. "Saint," cried another. The words clashed, a storm of hatred and sorrow, and Brandon felt as though the sky itself would split. He could not lift the axe. Not yet. Not for this man. His body screamed against it. The king knelt, laying his neck upon the block. His final words were steady, though muffled by the wind, that he died a faithful man, that he was the King of England, and that he had never betrayed his people. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the soldiers seemed to hold their breath. Brandon raised the axe, his arms trembling. He saw the pale flesh of the king's neck, the glint of royal hair beneath the hood. But as he prepared to strike, his mind broke. He saw not a king but a man, frail and human, one who believed God himself had placed him upon the throne. And Brandon's heart screamed louder than the crowd. "I cannot do this." The axe slipped from his hands, thudding into the wood of the scaffold. A gasp rose from the masses. Soldiers turned in shock. The moment froze, every breath suspended in disbelief. The executioner had refused. The silence shattered into chaos. The parliamentarians who orchestrated this death rose from their seats in fury. Soldiers surged forward. The crowd roared like a wounded beast, some jeering, others cheering. Brandon stumbled back, his face pale as chalk. He knew, in that instant, that he had sealed his fate. To refuse the execution of a criminal was disobedience. To refuse the execution of a king was treason. But for Brandon, in that moment of defiance, there was no regret, only the weight of what he had chosen. He would not kill the king. But he knew, with dreadful certainty, that this refusal would kill him. The axe lay abandoned on the scaffold, and for a breathless instant, all of England seemed to tremble on its edge. The silence that followed Richard Brandon's refusal did not linger long. Within moments, Parliament's guards seized control of the scaffold, dragging the bewildered executioner away like a criminal himself. But the story of why England had arrived at this dreadful hour, why its king was sentenced to die by his own people, had been decades in the making. To understand the trembling of Brandon's hands that morning, one must walk back through the fog of war, through the blood-soaked soil of a kingdom divided against itself. The seeds of this tragedy were sown in pride, belief, and betrayal. Charles Stuart was never meant to be a martyr. When he ascended the throne in 1625, he seemed destined for majesty. His coronation was a spectacle of divine symbolism. The golden orb and scepter, the anointing oils said to carry the authority of God himself. Yet even then, shadows stretched long over his reign. He was short, reserved, awkward in speech, a man who preferred ritual to politics, conviction to compromise. And conviction, in a king, can become the most dangerous weapon of all. England was restless. Beneath the crown's glitter lay hunger, plague, and poverty. Farmers groaned under taxes. Merchants despised royal monopolies. Parliament, a body of men long accustomed to advising kings, began to whisper of liberties, of rights, of power that should not bend so easily to royal command. But Charles believed otherwise. To him, kingship was not a matter of bargaining. It was sacred. He did not reign by Parliament's consent, but by God's will. And to resist him was to resist heaven itself. His belief was not uncommon. Across Europe, monarchs clung to the divine right of kings, a doctrine that cast rulers as earthly reflections of God's eternal order. But history has a cruel way of testing absolutes. Charles was tested early and often, and each test drove him further into the shadows. He quarreled with Parliament almost from the moment he wore the crown. When they denied him funds for his wars, he dissolved them. When they protested his taxes, he ruled without them. For 11 years, Charles reigned alone, a period his enemies later called the personal rule. To his supporters, it was the king exercising his rightful authority. To his opponents, it was tyranny. But money is the lifeblood of power, and war is the wound that bleeds it dry. Charles's wars against Spain and France had drained his coffers, and his ambitions in Scotland proved disastrous. The bishops' wars of the late 1630s were not mere border skirmishes, but conflicts of faith. Charles sought to impose Anglican prayer books upon the Scots, who clung fiercely to their Presbyterian traditions. To him, it was uniformity under God's church. To them, it was spiritual tyranny. The Scots rose in rebellion, their cries echoing across the border. It was then that Charles made his fateful error. Broke, desperate, he summoned Parliament once more in 1640. But the men who gathered were not meek advisers. They were emboldened, critics, sharpened by years of exclusion. They demanded reforms, limits upon the king, safeguards for the people. And Charles, proud and unbending, met their demands with disdain. The clash was inevitable. By 1642, the land itself split open, and England plunged into civil war. The English Civil War was no ordinary struggle of armies. It was brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, father against son. Villages burned, fields lay fallow, and bodies filled shallow graves. Archaeological excavations in places like Naseby and Edgehill reveal layers of musket balls and shattered bone, silent witnesses to the ferocity of the conflict. Whole families were torn apart by allegiance. Some marched for the royalist cavaliers who swore loyalty to the king. Others joined the parliamentarians, the Roundheads who fought for liberty, law, and what they claimed was the will of the people. The war raged for years, painting the land with fire. At first, Charles held ground, his royal standard fluttering defiantly. But as battles stretched on, the parliamentarian forces hardened. Under the command of men like Oliver Cromwell, a farmer turned soldier with fire in his eyes and iron in his faith, the new model army emerged. Disciplined, ruthless, and fueled by Puritan zeal, they became a force not of men, but of destiny. Their victory at Naseby in 1645 shattered the king's hopes. Royalist armies crumbled, cities surrendered, and Charles himself, betrayed by allies, fled into captivity. What followed was stranger than war. A king on trial, no English monarch had ever stood accused by his own subjects. To put Charles on trial was to shatter centuries of belief. Kings were judged by God, not by men. Yet Parliament was determined. They erected a high court of justice, an invention of desperation, for no such body had ever existed. In January 1649, Charles was brought before it, accused of treason against his own people. The trial was theatre as much as law. The charges were read aloud, that the king had waged war against Parliament, that he had shed the blood of his subjects, that he had betrayed the very trust placed in him. But Charles did not bow his head. He stood proud, cold, his voice steady, as he rejected the authority of the court. "I would know," he declared, "by what authority, I mean lawful authority, I am called hither." There was no answer that could satisfy him, for no answer existed. The authority came not from law, but from the will of victors. To Parliament, his refusal was proof of guilt. To his supporters, it was proof of dignity, as historians such as C.V. Wedgwood and modern scholars of the British Library have noted. The trial was less about justice than about symbolism. The people needed to see the king humbled. They needed to see him judged. They needed to see him bleed. But who would make him bleed? That was the dreadful question whispered in taverns and courts alike. To condemn Charles was one thing. To kill him was another. Executioners were men of shadows, outcasts whose trade was necessary yet despised. They lived apart from society, their families shunned, their names cursed. Even among them, few would dare lift a blade against a crowned monarch. Richard Brandon had inherited the role from his father, Gregory Brandon, who had been London's hangman before him. Generations of dishonour bound them to this grim craft. Yet even for Brandon, who had severed the necks of traitors like the Earl of Strafford, this task was unthinkable. Killing a king was no execution. It was sacrilege. Parliament knew this. Rumours spread that Brandon refused payment, that he trembled at the very suggestion. Some chronicles whispered that another executioner was sought, that men from outside London were approached. But in the end, it was Brandon who was pressed forward, whether by bribes, threats, or simple inevitability. The night before the execution, London itself seemed to mourn. Diaries from that winter describe the city as hushed, the bells muted, the fires dim. The frost clung to windows like breath upon glass, and every corner seemed to whisper of betrayal. The people did not yet know whether to rejoice or to weep, and so, on January 30th, 1649, the scaffold was raised outside the banqueting house at Whitehall. It was a stage of death built against a palace of life, for within that hall Rubens had painted glorious ceilings celebrating the divine right of kings, and beneath those painted angels, the anointed sovereign would lose his earthly crown. The axe gleamed in the pale light, but the hands that held it were unsteady. Brandon, wrapped in a mask to conceal his face from history, felt the world's eyes burning into his back. He knew the blade was not just steel. It was a line carved across time, dividing an age of kings from an age of men, and he did not want to cross it. The scaffold loomed like a black tooth against the winter sky, its timbers groaning under the weight of expectation. Richard Brandon stood beneath it, the executioner's hood heavy in his hands, and wondered not, for the first time, if he had already condemned his soul. He had killed many men, thieves, rebels, traitors, heretics. He had seen blood pour warm upon his wrists, had heard the soft thud of severed heads striking sawdust. He knew the sound a neck made when it split beneath steel, a wet crack, neither bone nor wood, but something between. Such knowledge was his inheritance. His father had died with a rope-burned hand, cursed as Gregory Brandon the hangman. Richard bore the same stain, no matter how deep he washed. Society needed men like him, yet despised them all the same. But this was different. This was no common man who waited upon the scaffold. This was Charles Stuart, King of England, Ireland, and Scotland, anointed by holy oil, crowned beneath the gaze of God. To kill him was not mere murder. It was the shattering of a world. The people whispered of curses. Priests warned that regicide would invite plagues, famine, the very wrath of heaven. In every tavern, voices quivered as they spoke of the axe that would sever not only flesh, but covenant, the covenant between crown and God. Brandon knew these whispers. He had heard them in the marketplace, felt them in the stares of neighbors who already treated him as a leper. If he raised the axe, he would not just be a hangman, he would be an abomination. His name would rot in the mouths of children, yet unborn, and worse, what if the curse clung to his bloodline? What if his own children bore the mark of a king's death? Yet Oliver Cromwell and his circle of iron men left him no escape. Cromwell was unlike any man Brandon had ever seen. Where others wore the silks of courtiers, Cromwell clothed himself in plain black, the garments of a Puritan soldier. His words struck like hammer blows cold, certain, devoid of doubt. To Cromwell, Charles Stuart was not God's anointed, but God's enemy, a pharaoh who had hardened his heart against the Lord. Scripture rolled from his tongue like fire, every verse sharpened into a weapon. Cursed is he who withholds his sword from blood. Cromwell thundered to his fellows, quoting Jeremiah. And blood, he promised, was the only path to liberty. When Brandon hesitated, Cromwell's envoys came to him in silence. Some offered money, 30 pounds of silver, as one chronicler noted with cruel irony. Others offered threats cloaked in scripture. If he refused, another would take his place. If he faltered, he might join the condemned upon the scaffold. Brandon's hands shook as he weighed their words, knowing that both obedience and refusal would damn him. In the weeks before the execution, Brandon's nights became a torment. His wife reported that he muttered in his sleep, that he woke drenched in sweat, clawing at his throat as though the king's ghost already strangled him. Neighbors whispered of seeing him in St. Sepulchre's churchyard, kneeling before graves in the dead of night, begging forgiveness from bones that could not answer. But forgiveness was a luxury England had abandoned. The city itself was a crucible of fear. Plague carts still rattled through London's streets, though the Black Death had waned decades earlier. Hunger gnawed at the poor, frost gnawed at the old, and everywhere the smoke of war still hung heavy. Soldiers of the new model army patrolled, with muskets at the ready, their eyes burning with a fanatic's light. Pamphlets littered the taverns, calling the king a tyrant, a murderer of souls, a man no better than Saul of the Old Testament. Yet just as many whispered of martyrdom, of prophecies that foretold the death of a holy sovereign. Historians note that even those who signed the king's death warrant hesitated when faced with the finality of the act. The parchment bore 50 names, men who believed themselves instruments of providence. But the blade itself, that was different. Signing ink was easy. Swinging steel was eternal. And so the burden fell to Richard Brandon. The night before the execution, he was summoned to Whitehall under guard. They brought him not to the warmth of council chambers, but to a shadowed room, where the axe lay upon a table, its edge newly honed to a glimmering crescent. Brandon stared at it as one might stare at a serpent. It was heavier than it appeared, a weight that seemed to drag his very soul down into the earth. Cromwell entered the chamber briefly, his voice calm, almost gentle. "You must understand," he said, "this is not the killing of a man, this is the execution of tyranny. Think not of Charles Stuart, think of England." Brandon said nothing. He could not. His mouth was dry, his tongue a stone. He bowed his head, not in agreement but in defeat, and outside, London prepared for spectacle. By dawn, carpenters had finished the scaffold, hammering nails that rang like funeral bells across Whitehall. Eyewitness accounts describe the crowd gathering in silence, tens of thousands pressed together, their breath rising in pale clouds. Soldiers kept them at bay, muskets glinting, lest grief turn to riot. The banqueting house loomed in the background, its painted ceilings mocking the scene below with visions of divine kingship. Some prayed aloud, others wept, a few cursed, and amid it all, Richard Brandon stood behind the scaffold, hood pulled low, the axe's handle slick in his grip. His heartbeat was a drum, his breath a ragged whisper. He told himself it would be quick, one strike, clean and final. But he knew, from bitter experience, how easily steel could falter. He remembered the Earl of Strafford's neck, how it had taken 2 strokes before the head rolled free. He remembered the cries of the crowd when an execution went wrong, the rage that could turn upon the hangman like wolves. But this was no ordinary head. This was a crown, invisible though it was that day, and he feared that no number of strokes could sever it cleanly. As the hour approached, He felt the scaffold itself tremble beneath his boots, or was it only his knees? He could not tell. All he knew was that history was breathing down his neck, hot and merciless, and that his name would forever be chained to this moment. Richard Brandon, the king's executioner. Not Richard the man, not Richard the father, the husband, the son. Only the shadow, the blade, the curse. And as Charles Stuart mounted the steps with calm dignity, as though ascending not to death but to judgment, Brandon realized that the king's final act might not be to save his crown, but to damn his executioner. Morning crept upon Whitehall like a shroud, grey and bitter, the frost crunching under the boots of soldiers who lined the street. London held its breath. Tens of thousands had gathered, spilling through the avenues, pressing against the wooden barriers, a sea of pale faces beneath the wintry sky. Yet the noise was not of riot, not of fury. It was something far worse. It was silence. Eyewitnesses spoke of that silence as if the city itself had turned to stone. Never was there so still. A crowd, wrote one onlooker, as though all mankind had frozen, and even the air dared not stir. The only sound was the dull thud of hammers as carpenters secured the last nails into the scaffold, sound that fell upon the heart like the tolling of a funeral bell. Richard Brandon stood already upon the platform, hood shadowing his face, though the cold sweat dripping down his temples betrayed him. His breath fogged within the mask. The axe lay upon a block of black oak, its blade gleaming like frozen moonlight. He had sharpened it the night before until his fingers bled, yet still he doubted it. Could steel truly sever a king? Or would it recoil, shatter, defy the blasphemy? He touched the handle, slick with oil, and felt his hands tremble. In his mind, he heard every curse, every prophecy. He who lifts his hand against the Lord's anointed shall be damned. The blood of kings shall poison the earth. He remembered the sleepless night before, the visions of fire and weeping angels, the weight of invisible chains upon his wrists. Then the cry went up, "The king comes." Charles Stuart emerged from the banqueting house with a serenity that unnerved even his enemies. Dressed in black velvet, his lace collar stark as snow, he carried himself not as a prisoner but as a monarch who had chosen his own hour. His step was firm, his gaze calm, his very bearing a rebuke to those who condemned him. The morning light seemed to halo his figure, and for a moment even his guards faltered. That as he mounted the steps to the scaffold, a ripple passed through the crowd, not of noise, but of grief unspoken. Many had believed the trial was but theatre, a show meant to humble the king before restoring him. Few had thought the axe would truly fall. Now reality struck, and hearts clenched with a terror beyond words. Charles removed his cloak, handing it to his attendant, Bishop Juxon, with a steady hand. His voice rang clear in the frozen air, carrying across the multitude, "I die the King of England. I die a faithful man of the Church. I forgive all my enemies, and I pray God forgive them too. I am the king still. The people are not free to set me aside. I die a martyr of the people." His words cut like a blade, sharper than Brandon's axe. They were not the trembling pleas of a broken man, but the testimony of one who embraced death as a crown. Even Cromwell, watching from the shadows, later confessed that the king had died with the stubborn dignity of a Roman. Brandon could not meet the king's eyes. He kept his gaze upon the block, upon the grain of the wood, dark and slick from countless deaths. His knees quivered beneath his robe. He whispered to himself, unheard, "One strike. Make it one strike. If I fail, may hell swallow me whole." Charles knelt before the block with calm deliberation. He tucked his hair beneath a silk cap, so that no strand might impede the blade. He stretched out his arms, as though embracing the earth, and whispered his final prayer, and then silence deeper than silence. Not a cough, not a breath, not even the flap of a pigeon's wing. It was as though the heavens themselves leaned in to watch. Brandon raised the axe. The world narrowed to steel and flesh, to the cold handle biting his palms, to the pale neck exposed upon the block. For a heartbeat, he froze. The weight of eternity bore down upon him, and in that instant, he felt himself fracture executioner, sinner, victim, all at once. Then the axe fell, a single stroke, clean, swift, merciless. The blade bit deep, bone cracked, sinew split. A sound like thunder echoed across the scaffold, followed by the soft, almost tender thud of a head striking wood. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No cry, no wail. Only the hiss of breath torn from 1,000 lungs at once, and then the silence. Eyewitnesses later swore that the silence was more terrible than any roar. We expected thunder, but we received a void. One man wrote, "It was as though the world itself recoiled. Women fainted. Men wept openly. Soldiers shifted uneasily. Muskets clutched as though to ward off spirits. Some whispered that the sun dimmed, that a cold shadow fell upon the land at the moment the king's soul departed." Brandon lifted the severed head, crimson dripping down his arms, and displayed it to the crowd. "Behold, the head of a traitor," he cried, though the words caught in his throat, hollow, mechanical. His voice carried no triumph, only the echo of compulsion. The crowd did not answer. No cheer, no rage, only that dreadful, suffocating stillness. The silence was not obedience, it was horror. It was the silence of a nation that knew it had crossed a threshold from which it could never return. As Brandon lowered the head, blood pooling at his feet, he felt a chill that no cloak could ward. His hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the relic. His stomach churned, bile rising, and for a moment he thought he would vomit upon the block itself. He wiped his palms against his robe, but the blood clung, sticky. Warm no water would wash it clean. In that moment, he knew he was damned not by men, not by Cromwell or Parliament, not even by history. He was damned by the act itself, by the severing of an anointed head from its body. He felt it as a curse, crawling beneath his skin, whispering that no grave would ever hold him, that his children's children would spit upon his name. Behind him, the soldiers began to dismantle the scene, but Brandon remained rooted, staring at the block as though it might speak. He swore he saw the wood pulse, heard the echo of the king's last prayer, smelled the iron tang of blood thickening into eternity. When he finally staggered away, the crowd parted as though avoiding a leper. None looked him in the eye. None spoke. He was already a ghost among the living, and thus ended not only the life of Charles Stuart, but the soul of Richard Brandon. For though his body walked from the scaffold, his spirit never left it. London awoke the morning after the execution not to triumph, but to dread. The scaffold at Whitehall had been dismantled overnight, yet the memory of what had transpired lingered like the stench of iron in the air. People whispered of the king's headless body lying in its coffin, of the crimson stains upon the block that no scrubbing could erase. Some swore that even after soldiers carried the corpse away, the scaffold groaned, as though the wood itself mourned. The silence of the crowd the day before had hardened into something colder. The sense that England had entered into covenant with damnation. Merchants who once bustled about the markets now spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact. Mothers drew their children indoors when soldiers marched past. Preachers thundered from their pulpits, some proclaiming that the people had been delivered from tyranny, others warning that they had murdered God's chosen servant. Yet even those who hated Charles Stuart found themselves haunted by the way he had died, unbowed, serene, regal, even in his last breath. To many, the axe had not destroyed him, it had sanctified him. Across the Channel, the news struck like a thunderclap. In Paris, crowds gathered at the Palais Royal, demanding to know whether the rumors were true. When confirmation came, Queen Henrietta Maria, widow of the slain king, collapsed in grief, her wails echoing through the gilded halls. France declared the act barbarous, the murder of a sovereign by his own subjects, a violation of every law, of God and man. In The Hague, the young Prince of Orange condemned Parliament as butchers. Even the Dutch, who had fought long wars for liberty against their own monarch, recoiled at the spectacle. If kings may be slain like cattle, one statesman wrote, then none may ever be safe, neither prince nor peasant. From Rome, the Vatican thundered with outrage. Pope Innocent X issued a denunciation, calling the execution a crime that cried out for divine vengeance. The Catholic world painted England as a nation possessed by devils, its rulers drunk on blood. Envoys whispered that plagues and storms would surely follow, the wrath of heaven descending upon the isle that had dared to sever the head of a king. Even allies of Parliament shifted uneasily. The very idea of monarchy had been shaken, but at what cost? Diplomats began to fear England not as a partner, but as a contagion, a land where sacred bonds had been violated. Within Westminster, Oliver Cromwell and his fellow regicides met not in jubilation, but in uneasy silence. The deed was done, yet it weighed upon them. They had expected relief, perhaps even elation, but what came instead was the chill of consequence. We cut off the head of a man, one whispered, but in so doing we may have unleashed a tempest. Cromwell himself, though outwardly resolute, was said to have walked his chambers that night, muttering prayers, gripping his sword as though expecting the shadows to rise against him. For Richard Brandon, the shadow had already risen. He returned to his home in East Smithfield, but found no rest. His hands still shook, his robes stank of blood, and his dreams were torn open by the vision of the king's calm eyes, staring at him from the block. When he closed his own eyes, he heard the soft thud of the severed head, again and again, echoing, like a heartbeat that would never cease. Neighbors shunned him, children spat at him in the streets, crying, "Kinkiller, damned butcher." Some crossed themselves when he passed, as though warding off a plague. Taverns refused him ale. Even those who once cheered his office, now whispered that his axe had cursed the city. Brandon turned to drink, drowning himself nightly in cheap gin. But the visions only grew sharper. He swore he saw the king's pale face in the bottom of his cup, his lips moving silently, delivering a judgment too terrible to hear. He heard footsteps following him in the dark, though no man was there. He felt hands gripping his shoulders, as he slept, dragging him back toward the scaffold. Rumors multiplied. Some said Brandon confessed in drunken fits that he had not wanted the deed, that he had been forced by threat of his own death. Others swore he had whispered to a priest that each time his axe fell, a piece of his soul had been severed, until nothing remained. One tale, recorded years later, claimed that Brandon awoke one night to find his hands bleeding, though no wound could be seen. "It is the king's blood," he cried. "It will never wash away." Neighbors found him in the street at dawn, his eyes wild, his shirt drenched in sweat, muttering that the dead walked beside him. Meanwhile, across England, the sense of unease deepened. Farmers claimed their fields yielded less, that the earth had grown barren since the king's blood touched it. Sailors swore storms rose suddenly upon the Channel, as if the sea itself rejected English ships. Preachers thundered of divine wrath, while mothers whispered of a curse upon every child born. In that year, whether these tales were superstition or truth mattered little. What mattered was belief, and belief spread like wildfire. The execution that was meant to cement Parliament's power instead birthed 1,000 whispers of damnation. Charles Stuart, in death, became larger than he had been in life. To some, he was a martyr. To others, a spectre haunting the nation. To all, he was a reminder that a line had been crossed, and nothing would ever be the same. And at the center of that storm stood Richard Brandon, the man with blood on his hands. History would scarcely record his name, yet his soul bore the weight of eternity. In taverns and marketplaces, his name became a curse, spat like venom, Brandon, the butcher of the king. But in the solitude of his chamber, with only the shadows for company, he whispered another truth, that he had not slain a man, but England itself, and that its ghost would haunt him until the day he died. The final months of Richard Brandon's life unfolded like a slow descent into hell. Once a man tolerated, even respected for his grisly office, he became a ghost wandering through London's alleyways. The neighbors no longer called his name. Children no longer played near his door. His wife, they said, rarely spoke to him, for he raved in the night, muttering of shadows that pressed their cold hands against his throat. The taverns, where once he drowned his thoughts in ale, shut their doors when he approached. Men spat upon the ground and muttered, "Kinkiller," before turning away. Some crossed themselves, for it was said the curse clung to him like a second skin. It was whispered that when he walked by, candles flickered low, as though the air itself recoiled. He grew gaunt, his eyes sunken deep, his hands trembling not only from drink, but from the weight of visions. Often he was seen stumbling in the streets, clutching his axe as though expecting to be summoned once more. One beggar swore Brandon pressed a coin into his hand and whispered, "Take it, for the king comes tonight, and I must pay the ferryman." Illness took hold, his breath grew ragged, his skin pale and clammy. Yet it was not sickness alone that consumed him, it was dread. Neighbors reported hearing his screams at midnight, cries that pierced the silence of East Smithfield. He shouted of figures at his bedside, of a man in white robes and a crown of light, who stood at the foot of his bed, watching silently. He begged for mercy, though no one was there. In June of 1649, less than 6 months after the axe fell, Richard Brandon collapsed. The manner of his death remains shrouded in rumor. Some said he wasted away from fever, others that he drank himself into the grave. But the stories that clung to his passing were darker still. One tale insists that on the night he died, his body convulsed, his mouth foamed, and his voice rose in a cry not his own. "The king calls me! The king calls me!" Those who claimed to have been present swore that a shadow passed across the room, though no lamp flickered, and that the stench of blood filled the air, though no wound was visible. He was buried quietly, without honor, in a simple grave at Whitechapel. No monument marks his resting place. Only whispers lingered that the earth itself would not accept him, that his coffin rattled with unseen hands, that dogs howled at the spot where he lay. To this day, his name is scarcely spoken in England, as though history itself sought to bury him deeper than the soil could dot. Yet the blood he spilled could not be hidden. England trembled in the years that followed. Cromwell rose as Lord Protector, wielding near absolute power, but his rule was shadowed by unrest, conspiracies, and the gnawing sense that divine wrath hung over the nation. Civil war flared again, and the land drank more blood. It was as if the king's execution had torn a hole in the fabric of fate, one that could not be mended. In 1660, with Cromwell dead and the Protectorate crumbling, Charles II, son of the beheaded king, returned to England in triumph. The monarchy was restored, and with it came vengeance. The men who had signed Charles I's death warrant were hunted down, executed, or their corpses dragged from graves to face posthumous justice. Even Cromwell himself did not escape. 3 years after his death, his body was exhumed, hanged in chains, and beheaded. His skull was placed on a spike, a grotesque mirror of the fate he had dealt to his king, and so the wheel turned. The curse of regicide did not rest with Richard Brandon alone. It seeped into the stones of London, into the bones of Parliament, into the bloodlines of kings and rebels alike. The act of severing a king's head had not ended tyranny. It had unleashed ghosts that would haunt the realm for generations. Legends endured. Some said Brandon's spirit still walks the alleys of East Smithfield, his axe glinting in the moonlight, forever searching for the king who waits beyond the veil. Others claimed that each storm over Whitehall carried his scream in its thunder, the eternal cry of a man who killed not only a king, but his own soul. What endures most is the lesson that, in the pursuit of power, in the arrogance of men who believe themselves greater than crowns, than law, than God, there lies a price that no throne and no sword can pay. The scaffold at Whitehall was not merely a stage for a king's death. It was an altar upon which a nation sacrificed its innocence. Richard Brandon died as he had lived, a shadow, a hand wielding the axe of history. But history itself, relentless and merciless, wielded the axe in return. And as the centuries pass, one truth remains carved in the silence of that January morning: the blood of a king never dries, and those who spill it are never free from its stain.